They think poison is a quick thing, a single wicked act, a dramatic sip and a fall. That's what keeps people safe in their own minds. They don't watch the slow habits. They don't count the teaspoons. They don't notice who has access to every cup, every bottle, every pulse that starts to stutter in the night. In Montgomery, Alabama, spring of 1856. I stood on an auction block at 70 years old and listened to white men argue about my value. Like I was a cracked pot. The auctioneer started at $50 and the silence came fast, thick as humidity. 40, 30, 20, 15. A few men laughed. One spat. Someone said, "Too old for field, too old for house." I didn't lift my chin in pride. I kept it level because pride makes you careless. Careless gets you killed. I watched the faces that mattered. The buyer with a red nose and a temper he wore like a badge. Thomas Thornton. The thin pale wife behind him. Margaret, already looking past me. The son with hungry eyes. Robert. The daughter Caroline, pretty and empty as porcelain. The boy Daniel, mean and bored at the same time. And the little girl Emma, staring too long like she was trying to understand why grown people did what they did. And then I saw him, Jesse, standing back with the stable boys, tall and lean, 16, trying to look invisible while his hands shook. My grandson, Jacob's blood. My last living tie to the child they tore from me. Jesse's mouth moved like he was speaking to Master Thornton, pleading. I didn't hear the words, but I saw the shape of them in his throat, the way begging costs a person something they never get back. Thornton finally raised his hand at $15, not because he wanted me, but because he didn't want to be bothered by Jesse anymore. $15, a bargain, a joke, a mistake. I walked down off the block with my legs steady, because I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me wobble. I'd been many things in 70 years, a girl in Virginia with dirt under her nails and my grandmother's hands on mine, teaching me which leaves cooled fever and which roots stopped bleeding. A young woman in North Carolina bent over cotton until my back learned to ache before the sun rose. A mother screaming as children were taken one by one. Then swallowing that scream the next time because I learned what screaming buys you in this world: rope, iron, punishment, emptiness. A healer who made herself useful enough to live, useful enough to move, useful enough to hear things other people didn't hear. My grandmother taught me that anything that heals can kill. She didn't say it with drama. She said it like a fact about weather. Measure, she told me. That's the difference, not mercy, measure. I carried that lesson through every sale, every plantation, every overseer's glare, every white doctor's sneer. Knowledge is the only thing they can strip off you in the yard. It sits behind your eyes and waits. By the time Cyrus Whitfield bought me at 55 and worked me 15 years outside Montgomery, I had a name people used when their bodies failed them. Mama Yoya. I treated fevers, infections, childbirth, broken bones. I saved lives because that was my trade, because it bought me small freedoms, and because every life you save becomes a quiet debt. When I heard through the grapevine that Jacob's son had ended up on Thornfield Thomas Thornton's plantation, something in me that had been sleeping sat up and opened its eyes. I asked Whitfield to sell me to Thornton. He laughed. Who's buying an old woman? Then Whitfield died. His estate was liquidated, and chance did what begging could not. Now here I was on Thornton's wagon, rolling toward Thornfield, the big white house visible before you ever reached it, columns like bones, cotton fields stretched out like a sentence you can't appeal, quarters tucked back like an afterthought. As we passed the gate, Thornton looked at me once and said, "Don't be trouble." I didn't answer. Trouble is a thing white men accuse you of when you breathe wrong. In the kitchen house, Aunt Ruth, head cook, 60 years old, sharp-eyed, looked me up and down like she was deciding where to place a piece on a board. "Old," she said, "but you got hands." I held them out. She saw the scars, the calluses, the steadiness. "I hear you know plants. I know what keeps people standing, I said. She grunted like that was enough. They gave me a garden plot behind the kitchen. I made it mine within a week. Neat rows, clean paths, my own order, chamomile, peppermint, lavender, willow bark, comfrey, garlic, ginger, feverfew, golden seal. Echinacea things no one questions, because they think they already understand them. And among them, tucked where a careless eye sees only green, the other plants. Foxglove with its purple bells, oleander pretty as a lie, Jimson weed with seeds like small teeth, pokeweed with berries that look harmless if you don't know, water, hemlock the one that can put a man down fast if you're foolish. I didn't plant those because I planned murder that first week. I planted them because I always had. A healer's garden is not a sermon, it's a toolbox. Every tool can build or break. On my second day, Jesse came to the kitchen house looking for me. When I saw him up close, my throat tightened in a way that made me angry, because emotions make you sloppy and sloppy gets you punished. He looked like Jacob, my boy, same dark eyes, same cheekbones, same way of leaning forward slightly as if he was ready to move. Grandma, he said, and his voice cracked on the word. We held each other behind the pantry wall, while Aunt Ruth banged pots louder than necessary to give us noise and privacy. Jesse told me his father had talked about me, that Jacob died when Jesse was 10, that Jesse had been sold twice since, that he begged Master Thornton to buy me because he wanted one person who was his. Just family, he said. Just somebody who remembers. I promised him I wasn't going anywhere. I meant it. And that promise is what made everything that followed feel like a knife pressed slowly into my ribs. The first months at Thornfield were a careful piece. I made myself indispensable the way I always had. Margaret Thornton suffered migraines that left her pale and shaking in her bed for days. The doctor, Dr. Pemberton from Montgomery, bled her, dosed her, prescribed tonics that did nothing. I gave her willow bark, feverfew, lavender. Within a week, her headaches eased. Within a month, she cried and held my hands like I was a miracle. Thomas had gout, swearing and limping, angry at his own body. I made poultices, teas, and the swelling went down. Robert cut his hand and it festered. I cleaned it properly, packed it right, and it healed. When a field worker came down with pneumonia, I sat by him in the quarters and kept him breathing through the worst of it. That one wasn't for the Thorntons. That was for us. People started saying my name with something like respect. Respect is dangerous too, but it can be useful, and the Thorntons trusted me. Trusted me with their sickness. Trusted me with their bottles, their cups, their routines. They trusted me because they never imagined I could be anything but what they decided I was. An old housewoman, grateful for scraps, grateful for survival. Meanwhile I watched, not with hunger, with habit. Because watching is how you stay alive. Daniel was the one I watched most. 17, then 18. Mean in small ways that add up. He kicked dogs, he slapped house girls and laughed if they flinched. He found excuses to make somebody carry something heavy twice. He liked the sound of fear, but he was also careless. Careless people leave openings. Robert was worse in a quieter way, hands that lingered too long, eyes that measured the girls in the quarters as if they were livestock. Thomas was a simmering pot that boiled over without warning. Margaret was nerves wrapped in lace, always apologizing, always avoiding conflict, always letting the men's cruelty pass as if her silence was not part of it. Caroline lived like she'd already given up, engaged to a man immobile, counting days. Emma watched everything and said little. Sometimes she looked at the kitchen house servants like she wanted to ask a question she didn't have words for. In those first months, I told myself my goal was simple. Stay alive, stay useful, stay close to Jesse. I didn't need revenge. I needed time. Then the first near miss happened, the kind that taught me Thornfield did not simply trust me, it used me. and that use came with eyes. Dr. Pemberton visited one afternoon when Margaret's headaches returned after a storm. He arrived smelling of cologne and horse sweat, looked at Margaret, then looked at my cup of tea on the bedside table and said, "What is that?" His tone wasn't curiosity. It was territorial. I told him the ingredients plain, no mystery. He took the cup and sniffed it, the way a man sniffs something he thinks is beneath him. He said. Willow bark. He paused, then added, feverfew. He looked at me sharper than before. For a second I wondered if he knew more than he let on. Then he set the cup down and said, "Don't overstep, overstep." As if relief was a line only his hands could cross, as if my work was theft. I nodded and lowered my eyes and let him. Believe he'd won. That night I told Jessie, quietly, that doctor is not stupid. Jessie swallowed and said, "Master, don't listen to him much. He doesn't have to," I said. All the doctor needs is one idea. From then on, I started measuring not just plants, but attention. I learned who lingered near the kitchen door, which house girl repeated gossip to accurately, which overseer's wife asked too many questions when she came to borrow a remedy. I wasn't planning murder yet, but I was building something else, a map of risk, because if I ever had to do something unforgivable, I couldn't afford a mistake. The second near miss came from inside the kitchen. Aunt Ruth's niece, a young kitchen helper, saw me drying pokeweed roots in a small cloth by the stove and wrinkled her nose. "What's that?" she asked, not accusing, just curious. Curious is how trouble starts. "For arthritis," I said, which was true in the right preparation. She reached for it like she wanted to touch, and I slapped her hand, not hard, but sharp enough to sting. Her eyes widened. "Don't," I said. "Some things ain't for playing." Aunt Ruth saw the look on the girl's face and came over. "What you doing?" she demanded. I told her, and Aunt Ruth's gaze stayed on me a beat too long. She had survived 60 years in that kitchen by noticing what others missed. "You careful," she said finally. "I don't need the big house. Thinking we got witchcraft back here." "I'm careful," I said. That night, I moved every plant that could raise a story into places only my hands reached. And I reminded myself, people don't have to know what a thing is to fear it. They just have to sense secrecy. The third near miss came from Daniel himself. One evening he wandered into the kitchen house half drunk, smelling of whiskey and sweat, and saw me crushing herbs. "Mama Yoya," he said, too friendly, the way predators get when they're bored. "You got something to make a man feel good." I kept my face blank. "Something for sleep," I said. "Something for pain." He leaned close enough that I could smell the sour in his breath. "You got something for courage?" he asked, and his eyes glittered like he was making a joke only he understood. Behind him, the young house girl carrying plates froze. I felt the moment tighten, the way a rope tightens before it snaps. "Courage," I said, and I let a small smile show, the kind old women use to make men underestimate them. "That's born in a man or it ain't." Daniel barked a laugh, but his eyes narrowed. For a second I thought he might push, might demand, might decide to make me afraid for sport. Then Thomas called his name from the yard and Daniel turned away. Bored again. The house girl exhaled like she'd been holding her breath. After he left, Aunt Ruth hissed at me, "Don't talk." Back to him. "I didn't," I said. "I fed his ego." She shook her head. "That boy gonna kill somebody one day." I stared at the mortar in my hands and thought, he already has the hands for it. All he needs is a reason. And the plantation kept giving him reasons: heat, whiskey, entitlement, the knowledge he could do anything and the world would excuse it. By October, the harvest push turned Thornfield into a machine that never stopped. Cotton doesn't care if you're tired. Cotton doesn't care if your fingers split. The gin house ran from dawn until dark, teeth chewing through white fiber. Dust thick in the air, Even house servants were sent to carry, to sort, to haul. Jesse, usually in the stables, was reassigned to the gin house for extra hands. He came to see me before his first shift and tried to smile. "It's only for harvest," he said. "I'll be fine." I looked at his hands and saw how careful they were. How he treated animals like they mattered. The gin house doesn't reward careful, it rewards fast. "Keep your eyes open," I told him. "Stay out of Daniel's way." Jesse's jaw tightened. "He don't like me," he admitted. "He don't like anybody," I said. "But you can't give him a reason." Jesse nodded, and I watched him walk away, tall and thin against the glare of morning. And I felt something I didn't want to name: fear. Not for me, for him. Fear makes you bargain with God even when you don't believe in God. That day the air felt wrong. Not storm wrong, people wrong. The house girls whispered that Daniel was in a foul mood because Thomas refused him money for a new horse. That kind of anger seems small if you've never lived under it, but I've seen men like Daniel turn small disappointments into somebody else's broken body just to prove they can. I spent the morning in the kitchen, preparing remedies, and watching the door, waiting for Jesse to swing by for water the way he often did when he worked outside. He never came. Noon passed, then afternoon, and the gin house roar carried on the wind like an animal growl. Then, late in the day, I heard shouting, not the usual shouting over the machines, but a sharper sound. Panic threaded through it, and Ruth paused mid-stir and frowned. One of the kitchen girls ran to the door and looked out. "Something happened," she said. My body moved before my mind finished deciding. I stepped outside and the sun hit my eyes hard. Across the yard, a boy ran from the direction of the gin house, arms pumping, face white. Another followed. Then I saw the men carrying a door ripped off its hinges, using it as a stretcher, moving fast and uneven like they'd forgotten how to walk. A smear of dark stained the cloth at the top of the door. My mouth went dry. I started toward them, then forced myself not to run. Running draws eyes. Running makes a scene. Scenes get explanations you don't want, but my feet didn't. Listen. The ears fell off me for a moment, and I was moving too fast for 70. When they got close enough, I saw the hair. Jesse's hair, matted, dark with something that wasn't sweat. His face was swollen in a way that made my stomach flip. His eyes were closed. A man beside the stretcher kept saying, "Move, move," like speed could undo what happened. "Jesse," I said, and my voice came out thin. The men wouldn't meet my eyes. One of them, shaking, whispered, "Master Daniel." He got mad. That's all he dared. That was enough. I reached for Jesse's hand, and it was still warm. And that warmth broke something in me, because it meant he was not gone yet, which meant there was time for hope, and hope is the cruelest thing you can be handed at the edge of disaster. "Where's he hurt?" I demanded. "Head," another man muttered. "Back too." I saw the indentation near the side of Jesse's skull, felt the wall tilt. They carried him past the kitchen house toward the quarters because that's where we handle our own pain. That's where white people send suffering so they don't have to see it. I followed, and in my mind, every lesson my grandmother taught me lined up like tools on a table. Stop bleeding. Prevent infection. Ease pain. Keep him breathing. Keep him from thrashing. Keep eyes away from what they don't need to see. But underneath that practical list was something cold arising. Something that didn't have words yet, only shape. The shape of a plan being born, not from prophecy, not from certainty, but from the simplest truth a body can learn. If Jesse dies and nothing happens to the ones who did it, then this world is exactly what I have always known it is, and any softness I've been clinging to is just another way they keep you obedient. As we reached the quarters, I heard hoofbeats in the yard behind us and a familiar voice barking orders. Thomas Thornton. He sounded annoyed, not afraid. Annoyed like a man inconvenienced by broken equipment, I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes on Jesse's face as they laid him on a pallet inside the cabin, and when I put my fingers to his head and felt bone give where it shouldn't, I understood with a calm that frightened me. This is where the story changes, and I have to be careful, because the same people who can do this to him can do anything to me if they suspect what I might do next. I worked on Jesse like a woman who had done this 100 times and like a woman who had never wanted to do it again, both at once. Because panic wastes what little time you're given, and grief makes your hands shake if you let it. I cleaned the blood from his scalp slowly, gently, feeling the edges of the wound with my fingertips, mapping the damage the way my grandmother taught me, not guessing, not hoping, just learning what was there. The skull had a soft place where there should have been none. That told me more than any scream could. Still, I did what I could. I packed the wound with clean cloth and herbs to slow the bleeding. I brewed willow bark and valerian to ease his pain and quiet his body, so he wouldn't thrash and make it worse. I spoke to him because sound keeps people anchored when their minds start slipping, and I needed him anchored, needed him here, needed time to do something impossible. People crowded the doorway. Men from the Jean house, women from nearby cabins, Aunt Ruth hovering at the edge, like she wanted to help but didn't know how without drawing attention. Somebody ran for water. Somebody else ran for my basket. I felt eyes on me, measuring, watching, the way eyes always do when something bad happens and blame hasn't found a home yet. I could feel Thomas Thornton outside before I saw him, the air changing with his presence, his boots loud on the dirt like he wanted everyone to hear him coming. He stopped in the doorway and looked down at Jesse, then at me. His face was tight. Not with grief, but with irritation. "What happened?" he asked, already knowing the answer didn't matter. "He was beaten," I said, because lies rot you from the inside, and I had nothing left to lose by naming the truth. Thomas's jaw clenched. "Daniel lost his temper," he said, as if that explained a storm. "He didn't mean. He hit him in the head." I cut in, and felt the room go still. Thomas stared at me like I'd stepped somewhere I wasn't allowed. "What's your tone?" he said. "This is my house. And that's my blood," I said quietly, and surprised myself with how steady it sounded. For a moment I thought, he might strike me, old or not. Then he did something worse. He shrugged. "Accidents happen," he said. "I've spoken to Daniel. It won't happen again." He glanced at Jesse again, then away. "Get him settled. I'll send some extra food down." Extra food, as if bread could stitch bone. He left without checking if Jesse was breathing. That was the moment the last soft thing in me cracked, not because I was surprised, because I wasn't. The law had spoken through Thomas Thornton's mouth, clear as any judge. This life did not count. When night fell, the cabin filled with quiet sounds, breathing, praying, the occasional sob someone tried to swallow. Jesse's breathing grew wet, uneven. Blood seeped from his ear. A bad sign I didn't want to see but couldn't ignore. I sat with him, holding his hand, talking when he stirred, silent when he slept, counting his breaths the way you count time when you're afraid to look at the clock. On the second day he opened his eyes and looked at me like he was trying to remember where he was. "Grandmama," he whispered, and my chest ached so hard I thought it might split. "It hurts." He said. "I know," I told him. "I'm here." He asked me to tell him about his father, not the hard parts, the small ones, what Jacob was like when he was little. So I told him stories I'd held onto like coins in a pocket, stories about a boy who climbed trees and came home muddy and laughed easy, stories about a young man who loved fierce and paid for it. Jesse listened, his eyes drifting, his breathing slowing. On the third morning, just before dawn, he woke again, clearer than before, the way dying people sometimes do, like the fog lifts just to show you the edge. "Don't cry," he said, and smiled at me, A small tired smile. "I'm gonna see Daddy." He went quiet in my hands, and that was that. I made a sound, then I didn't recognize as my own. Something torn out of me that had been buried for decades. And the women pulled me back before I hurt myself or him. They washed Jesse's body and wrapped him and carried him to the small patch of ground beyond the fields where we bury our dead without markers, without names, without permission. Old Moses said words. We sang because singing is what's left. When nothing else works. Thomas Thornton came that evening, stood in the doorway again like a man visiting a problem, not a death. "I'm sorry about the boy," he said, stiff and awkward. "Daniel didn't mean to kill him." He looked at me then, really looked. "Don't do anything foolish. Yeah, remember your place. The law don't see this as a crime." I said yes, because saying no would have been suicide. Inside, something settled. Grief burns hot. What replaced it was cold. Cold keeps you alive. I went back to work after 3 days. Just like he ordered. I tended my garden. I brewed my teas. I smiled my old woman smile and let people praise my strength. Margaret hugged me and cried. Said she couldn't imagine my pain. Caroline brought me a shawl she'd wear upon, her hands shaking. Even Robert muttered an apology, eyes sliding away. Daniel avoided me, not out of guilt, but boredom. They all thought the danger had passed. That was their mistake. I wasn't planning a quick thing. Quick things get noticed. I needed slow. I needed natural. I needed to make each step look like the body doing what bodies sometimes do. I started with Daniel, but not because he was the easiest, because he was careless. Careless men trust patterns. A month after Jesse's burial, Daniel came into the kitchen house complaining about his stomach. "Cramps," he said. "Can't eat right." He smelled of whiskey and grease. "You got something?" I looked at him and saw the boy who swung the wooden handle down on my grandson's head and felt nothing stir in my face. "Of course," I said. I gave him peppermint and ginger, real medicine. It helped. He came back the next day, and the next. I gave him the same thing. I let his body learn to trust my cup. That was the first measure. The second measure came with a pinch of pokeweed root, dried fine, barely there. In small amounts, it eases pain. In larger ones, it destroys you from the inside. I watched him closely. I kept notes in my head the way my grandmother taught me, adjusting, never rushing. His stomach troubles came back worse. He complained. I nodded sympathetically and gave him more tea. Dr. Pemberton was called when Daniel's symptoms didn't make sense. The doctor asked questions. I answered them carefully, truth braided with omission. He suspected ulcers, inflammation. He prescribed rest and bland food. Daniel followed his advice and still drank my tea because it was the only thing that seemed to help. That was my opening. As Daniel weakened, I felt eyes on me again. Aunt Ruth watched the cups. Margaret hovered in doorways. Once, Dr. Pemberton took a cup from Daniel's hand and sniffed it. His brow furrowing. "You sure about this?" he asked me. "I've been treating him for weeks," I said. "You have?" he agreed and handed the cup back. The line held. By winter Daniel was thin and grey, confined to bed, writhing with pain that no bleeding or leech could fix. He died in January, and the house filled with wailing and whispered prayers and the relief people feel when a cruel thing ends, even if they won't name it. I sat with Margaret as her son took his last breath and held her, while she sobbed into my shoulder. Inside, I felt nothing. The funeral was big, society turning out to mourn, to reassure itself that God still had a plan. They buried Daniel in the family cemetery with stone and iron. Jesse lay in dirt with no name. That difference kept me steady. When doubt tried to creep in, I didn't celebrate. I counted, 1 down. Margaret's migraines returned with a vengeance after Daniel's death. Stress, the doctor said, of course. She came to me, desperate. I gave her willow bark and feverfew again. And this time I added foxglove, measured like a prayer. Foxglove strengthens a weak heart until it doesn't. The line is thin, that's why it works. Her headache eased. Her heart began to fail slowly, quietly. Palpitations, swelling, shortness of breath. Dr. Pemberton diagnosed a weak heart, prescribed rest. She drank my tea faithfully, thanking me, telling me I was a blessing. Once, as I helped her drink, she gripped my wrist and whispered, "Promise me you'll stay." I promised, and meant it in the way people mean promises when they know they are lies. By the time Margaret died the following September, Thornfield was already changing. Thomas drank more. Robert gambled harder. Caroline's engagement wavered. Emma watched from corners. I stood at Margaret's funeral and felt the cold satisfaction again, tinged this time with something else, fear not of being caught, but of how easy it had been. That fear kept me careful when I turned my attention to Thomas and his whiskey, to the bitters I made for him every 2 weeks, to the water hemlock roots I dried and ground so fine it vanished into darkness. But that part comes next. Thomas Thornton was harder than his son and his wife, not because he was smarter, but because his body had been allowed to do whatever it wanted for 40-odd years without consequence. Men like him mistake endurance for strength. They think surviving excess means they are unbreakable. I had been watching Thomas since the day I arrived at Thornfield, not with hatred at first, but with the habit of a healer who knows that everybody advertises its future if you pay attention. He drank every evening, sometimes alone, sometimes with Robert. Always the same routine, always the same glass, always the same bottle of bitters he added with a little flourish, like it was a mark of refinement. Those bitters were mine. I had been making them since my first month there. Gentian root, orange peel, cardamom, a few other harmless things that made his whiskey taste fancy. As he liked to say, he trusted that bottle the way people trust rituals. Rituals make men careless. After Margaret's death, Thomas unraveled in small ways he pretended were nothing. He snapped at servants more often. He forgot meetings. His hands shook slightly when he poured his drink, though he laughed it off as age or nerves. That was when I began, quietly, carefully, because I had learned from Daniel that speed invites eyes. I chose water hemlock not because it was dramatic, but because it was patient if you respected it. In small, repeated doses. It doesn't look like poison. It looks like decline. I dried the root until it was pale and brittle, ground it until it was finer than flour, and added it to the bitters in amounts so small even my grandmother would have approved of the restraint. The first weeks brought nothing obvious. That was the point. Then Thomas complained of dizziness. He stumbled once on the stairs and cursed his boots. His hands shook more noticeably when he wrote. He slurred words occasionally, and everyone assumed whiskey. Dr. Pemberton examined him and frowned, found nothing he could name. Nerves, he said. Stress. He told Thomas to drink less. Thomas laughed and poured another glass. By winter, the tremors worsened. Thomas dropped things. His balance failed him at odd moments. Once, in the yard, he nearly fell from his horse and the overseer caught him by the arm. "Careful, sir," Garrett said, and Thomas shook him off, embarrassed and angry. The first seizure came without warning. Robert found him in his study on the floor, convulsing, blood on his tongue. I was called because that's what you do when you don't know what else to do. I knelt beside Thomas and did what I always did, loosened his collar, turned his head, waited for the body to decide if it was done yet. When it passed, he lay there gasping, eyes wild, and I saw fear in him for the first time. Real fear, the kind that knows power can slip. Dr. Pemberton was frantic, tried bleeding, leeches, tonics, everything he knew how to do. Nothing helped, because the cause sat quietly in a dark bottle beside Thomas's chair. The seizures returned, each worse than the last. Between them, Thomas faded. His mind wandered. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold his glass. The plantation began to rot around him. Crops failed. People ran. Robert tried to manage and failed publicly. Garrick took over more than he should have been allowed to. Thornfield smelled different then, like damp wood and old whiskey and panic. On March 12, 1858, Thomas had his fifth seizure and did not come back from it. Dr. Pemberton called it a stroke brought on by drink and grief. The funeral was smaller, fewer people came. They whispered the word cursed when they thought no one important was listening. I stood at the back and thought of Jesse's grave under scrubby ground, no one marked. 3 down. Robert inherited what remained, and it broke him. He drank harder, slept less, paced the house at night like something was chasing him. He came to me for help because everyone else had failed him. I can't sleep, he said. I can't think. I gave him teas that truly calmed at first. Valerian, passion flower, chamomile. He slept. He trusted me. When he depended on that sleep, I added Jimson weed, seeds crushed fine, just enough to bend his mind without snapping it all at once. The dreams came first. He told me about them. Eyes hollow, voice shaking. I told him grief does that. He believed me. The dreams bled into waking hours. Shadows moved where nothing stood. Voices whispered his name. He stopped eating, afraid of poison. Not knowing how close he was to the truth, Caroline tried to help him, dulled her own fear with laudanum, missed the signs until they were too loud to ignore. Robert wandered the house muttering, accusing, apologizing, firing servants and begging them back. On July 18, 1858, after 3 days without sleep, he went into his father's study, sat in Thomas's chair, and put a pistol to his head. Caroline found him the next morning. I looked at his body and felt nothing like satisfaction, only a deep, quiet exhaustion. 4 down. The house felt empty then, hollowed out. Caroline came to me weeks later, eyes red, hands shaking, said she didn't know what to do. Her engagement was gone. The debts were crushing. Emma needed her. She asked me what she should do. I told her to take Emma to Mobile, to her aunt's, to leave Thornfield behind. I watched her face crumple with guilt and relief. She left 2 weeks later. The plantation sold for scraps. Families were split. I was sold again. This time to a small farmer near Selma named Samuel Henderson, who paid $5 for an old woman and thought he'd gotten a bargain. I worked his garden quietly for 2 more years, until my heart stopped in my sleep in June of 1860. No one ever knew what I did. No one ever asked. History didn't record it, but I remember. And that has always been enough. People think the worst of it ends when the shouting stops, when the funerals thin out, when the house finally goes quiet. They're wrong. The worst part is the space afterward, the waiting, the feeling that the world has slipped out of its old shape and nobody knows what to do with the pieces. After Robert died, Thornfield felt like a body that had lost its pulse but hadn't realized it yet. Doors stood open where they shouldn't. Shutters banged in the wind until someone remembered to tie them. The kitchen ran on habit alone. Aunt Ruth barking orders that sounded smaller without the big house listening. Caroline moved through rooms like she was afraid to touch the walls, afraid they might accuse her. Emma followed her everywhere, silent, eyes too old for 10. I watched them both, and for the first time since Jesse's death, I hesitated, not because I suddenly believed in mercy as some clean thing, but because killing had stopped feeling like justice and started feeling like work. That frightened me more than anger ever had. Caroline came to me one afternoon with her hands wrapped tighter on each other, knuckles white. "Mama Yoya," she said, voice shaking. "I don't know how to keep this place. I don't know how to be what they expect." She talked about debts, about overseers stealing, about neighbors who wouldn't look her in the eye anymore. She talked about Emma waking up screaming from dreams he couldn't explain. When she finally stopped talking, She looked at me like I had answers for everything. The way sick people always do. I thought of Daniel's grin, of Thomas's shrug, of Robert's empty stare. And then I thought of Jesse, 16 and careful, trying to stay out of a storm that was never going to spare him. Caroline wasn't innocent, but she was trapped in the same machine, just cushioned better. Emma even more so. Go to Mobile, I told her. Take your sister. Leave this place. She cried then, real crying, the kind that empties you. What about you? She asked. What about everyone? Here. I told her the truth because lies had already done enough damage. We'll be sold. We always are. 2 weeks later, Caroline and Emma were gone. Thornfield went up for sale, and no one wanted it. The land was tired. The name was sour. The debts were thick as mud. Eventually a speculator from Georgia bought it cheap, broke it apart, sold people in lots like tools. Families were split again. Because that's how things end, when nobody powerful is left to pretend they care. I was sold to Samuel Henderson near Selma. $5 for an old woman who knew plants. He was neither cruel nor kind, just indifferent, which felt like rest. I tended a small garden, made simple remedies, stayed out of the way. The years slowed. My hands ached more. My sleep grew deeper. I thought about Jesse every day, about whether he would have wanted what I'd done, whether justice taken this way stains the hands that take it. I never found an answer that mattered. I died in my sleep on June 23, 1860, heart giving out quietly, like it had finally decided it was tired of carrying so much. Henderson noted it in his book as a fact, nothing more. No one marked my grave. Thornfield burned during the war, people said, though nobody knew who lit the fire. The slave cemetery was paved over decades later, turned into a parking lot. History moved on the way it always does, stepping over bones without slowing. But I remember Jesse's voice, the weight of a cup in my hand, the way trust sounds when it breaks. I remember what knowledge can do in a world that refuses justice, and what it costs the one who uses it. That memory is the only monument I have, and it's heavier than stone. After Robert died, time at Thornfield stopped behaving the way time is supposed to. Days dragged and nights collapsed into each other until I could no longer tell whether I had slept or simply closed my eyes and reopened them into the same hour. The house no longer sounded alive. It creaked differently, like a body shifting, in pain, floors complaining under no weight at all. I kept working because work gives shape to time when grief hollows it out. I tended the garden even though no one cared what grew there anymore. I dried roots no one would ask for. I brewed teas no one drank. People avoided the kitchen house now. Not because they feared me, but because they feared the house itself, feared the way death had moved through it without leaving fingerprints. Servants whispered that the Thorntons were cursed. Overseers drank harder. Neighbors stopped visiting. Thornfield had become a place people passed without looking directly at it, like a sky. You don't want to remember how you got. Caroline tried to hold things together, but she was drowning in responsibilities that had never been meant for her. She sat with ledgers she didn't understand, argued with Garrett, who smiled too easily now, listened to men speak to her, way they speak to women when they think authority has slipped into something fragile. At night she walked the halls with a lamp, checking doors that were already locked, checking windows that faced nothing but dark fields. Emma followed her like a shadow, quiet, absorbing everything. I saw the girl watching me sometimes, her eyes steady, searching my face as if she sensed something but didn't yet know how to name it. That look unsettled me more than suspicion ever had, because it wasn't fear. It was recognition trying to form. One evening, Emma asked me why people died so much in this house. Children ask questions adults don't want to hear. I told her that bodies sometimes break under too much weight. It was the closest thing to truth I could give her, without shattering whatever future she still had. Robert's death changed Caroline in a way Daniel's and Thomas's never could. There was no enemy left for her anger, no man to blame, just silence and debt and decay. She began taking laudanum the way her mother had, not to die, but to soften the edges of being awake. I watched her hands shake when she poured it, watched her eyes lose focus mid-sentence, watched Emma learn too young how to guide her sister back to bed. I could have intervened. I could have brewed something gentler, something that might have steadied Caroline's nerves. But I didn't, not because I wanted her to suffer, but because I understood now that saving someone in that house would only bind them tighter to it. Thornfield didn't heal people. It consumed them, and I was so tired of feeding it. The sale notices went up quietly, tacked to boards, passed hand to hand. Men came to look at the land, at the books, at the people, their eyes cold, calculating, already dividing lives in their heads. When the auction finally came, it felt smaller than the others, less spectacle, more scavenging. People were sold in lots. Families were separated with the same indifference as always. But this time, there was no Thornton watching from a porch, no authority pretending to oversee the damage. The house stood empty as people were led away from it, shutters flapping like loose skin. When my turn came, no one haggled. Samuel Henderson paid $5 for me and didn't look me in the eye. $5 for a woman who had ended a lineage. $5 for a lifetime of knowledge, grief, restraint, and blood. I climbed onto his wagon without argument, without relief, without triumph, just quiet. Henderson's farm near Selma was smaller, poorer, and honest in its cruelty. He wanted work. I gave it. I tended his garden, mixed remedies for joint pain and coughs, delivered one child who lived and another who didn't. No one asked me questions. No one praised me. No one feared me. That anonymity felt like rest. At night I dreamed of Jessie, not dying, but working, brushing down a horse, laughing at something small, alive in a way memory insists on even when reality has moved on. Sometimes I dreamed of Daniel's face when pain finally replaced arrogance, of Thomas gasping on the floor, of Robert staring at ghosts that were never ghosts at all, only consequences. I didn't wake from those dreams in terror. I woke tired, deeply, bone-weary tired. In my last year, my hands shook the way Thomas's had. I noticed it without fear. I knew what bodies did when they were done carrying what they had carried too long. On the night my heart stopped, there was no drama, no pain, just a sense of letting go, like setting down a heavy basket you've been hauling your whole life and only then realizing how much it weighed. Henderson found me in the morning and wrote a line in his diary that meant nothing beyond the ink it used. An old Negro woman passed in the night. That was all. Thornfield burned during the war, they say. Some claim Union soldiers did it. Others say locals set it alight because cursed places make people uneasy. I don't care who struck the match. Fire was always going to find that house. The slave cemetery was paved over years later, turned into a parking lot where people leave cars and think about nothing at all. Jessie's grave disappeared the way so many do, swallowed by progress that never asks permission. But memory doesn't need a marker. Memory lives where history refuses to look. I remember the weight of every cup I lifted, every decision I measured, every moment I chose patience over mercy and silence over confession. I remember how justice feels when the law has no use for it, and how power tastes when it's quiet and unrecorded. I remember that they bought me for nothing because they thought I was finished, and how wrong they were about what an old woman can carry, and what she can end. If you are listening to this, then I am already what history calls finished. A line, in a book, a rumor, a silence. I am not here to ask you to forgive me, because forgiveness belongs to people who believe the world plays fair. I am here because memory does not die when bodies do. And because stories are the only graves some of us are allowed to have. I have heard people argue about what I did, as if it were a puzzle, as if intent could be weighed cleanly against consequence. They ask whether it was justice or murder, as if the law had ever bothered to ask that question for someone like Jesse. When Daniel swung that wooden handle and brought it down on my grandson's head, there was no courtroom waiting for him, no jury to consider motive, no balance to be struck. There was only a body on the ground, and a father who shrugged and said accidents happen. That was the moment the rules were stated plainly. Not in books, not in speeches, but in flesh. From that moment on, every choice I made existed inside those rules, not outside them. I did not wake one morning wanting blood. I woke wanting the world to make sense again, and when it refused, I used the only language it had ever listened to. I measured, I waited, I watched. I did not act in rage, because rage burns to bright and shows your face. I acted the way the land acts when it's been poisoned too long, slowly, quietly, without apology. Each death looked natural because the system itself is unnatural. Each body failed in a way doctors could explain because doctors are trained to see bodies, not causes. I did not outsmart the law. I stepped into the space where the law never stood. Some of you will want me to say I regret it. I won't lie. To make you comfortable, I regret that Jesse died thinking the world might still be fair. I regret that I lived long enough to learn exactly how unfair it is. I regret that knowledge can turn love into something sharp enough to kill, but I do not regret taking from them what they took from me, piece by piece, in a way they could never name. Because if justice is only justice when it wears a uniform and carries a stamp, then it is not justice at all, it is permission. And permission was never given to us. You might think the story ends with my heart stopping in that small cabin near Selma, with Samuel Henderson writing a sentence that erased me. It doesn't. Stories like this don't end. They sink. They settle into the ground beneath places like Thornfield and wait. When people say that house was cursed, they imagine ghosts, and fire and superstition. They never imagine consequence. They never imagine that a place built on taking will one day give back what it took. Not all at once, not loudly, but completely. Thornfield burned, but not because of me. It burned because it was dry with lies and soaked in grief and waiting for a spark. Jesse's grave disappeared under asphalt, but not because memory failed. It disappeared because progress does not like reminders. That parking lot holds more bones than the people who walk across it will ever know. I am not asking you to carry my guilt. I am asking you to see what made it necessary. I am asking you to notice who benefits when certain deaths are called accidents, and others are called crimes. I am asking you to understand that knowledge is power, but power always charges interest. It took my sleep. It took my softness. It took my belief that surviving was enough. And still, if I were given those years again, those hands, that garden, I would do it the same way, because the alternative was silence. And silence is the only thing that ever truly belongs to the people who hurt us. I did not leave children behind. I did not leave a headstone. I left a memory that refuses to stay buried, and that is more dangerous than anything I ever brewed. If you are uncomfortable now, if you feel the need to decide whether I was monster or mother, murder or mirror, then the story has done its work, because the truth lives in that discomfort. The truth is that the world taught me exactly how to do what I did, long before I ever chose to do it. And the world has been thanking itself for that lesson ever since, pretending it never learned it at all.